Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week I've got Dr. Enya Doyle with me, who's the harassment doctor.
Hi everyone, it's nice to be here. Lucinda, thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Enya Doyle, the harassment doctor. My background is in academic research, so I finished my PhD, which was on sexism in classical music back in 2020. I've been consulting ever since. So I do a lot of work on gender, sexism, structural inequalities that start there, and a lot of work on sexual harassment, hence the harassment doctor.
I've just got to ask. So your PhD. What inspired you with that topic?
So I have 3 music degrees now. I am a kind of classical musician in my retirement era at the age of 31. But I basically wanted to do more research into how girls and women are excluded from cathedral music. I was a cathedral chorister as a kid. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the institutional kind of decisions that were being made and the structural kind of approaches to women and girls in music. So it ended up being me versus the Church of England. I did a lot of research interviewing people across England, kind of thinking about the barriers. So my PhD is on the barriers to gender equity in cathedral music. The first one is institution, the second is tradition, the third is how we think about bodies, and the fourth is leadership.
Wow. So quite a deep passion, I guess, for the topic,
Yeah.
deep-seated, almost a purposeful thing, and then taking this into the workplace for a way to So I guess starting out, I mean, we were talking just before we came on here about the sort of audience that listens to the HR Uprising podcast. So it is HR and leaders. And obviously there's lots of HR professionals in public sector, larger organisations. I think often with ED&I, that sort of thing, they have more support. They're maybe more aware of those things. Certainly, that's where I've come across issues with bullying and harassment. But what I thought was quite interesting to get your expertise on is thinking of those people who are listening to the podcast who are perhaps an HR department of 1 or 2 in a smaller business where you feel like you're a lone voice. And I wondered if you could maybe speak to how would you identify issues in that area, and obviously we'll talk about how we could address them.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important, particularly thinking about smaller departments where it feels like you're kind of running at 300 miles an hour. Just because you are a HR department of 1 doesn't mean that people, individual bad actors or systems aren't going to create an environment where people are going to bully or harass their colleagues. It happens everywhere. And I think that's the first thing to say is, as someone who has a kind of background in safeguarding, where we talk about kind of it could happen anywhere, from a safeguarding approach, I think it's not just naive, but really reckless to assume that you've got an environment where it would never happen. And particularly the work that I do with small organisations, and particularly the charity sector too, it seems that that isn't an approach that is taken. So I'd say that's the first thing, is kind of the confrontation of the fact that it could be happening. Just because you haven't heard about it doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that people aren't reporting it, or perhaps don't recognize it. And we see particularly, you kind of got the individual to individual not being able to recognize what's happened to them, kind of know that it's off, but don't know why, don't know the law, shouldn't know the law, like particularly like if you're a chef or if you're an accountant or whatever, why would you know that legislation? Why would you know it in depth? And that's fine. There's nothing kind of wrong with that. But you see a lot of people not knowing what harassment is, and not knowing when something's crossed the line from okay, that was probably ill-advised to I think you've actually violated a law there, or you violated our policy. So I think awareness is obviously kind of key, and that's the first thing, and it starts from the top. So if you're a HR team of one, the first thing that I would say is to get half an hour with your CEO, and whether that's together or otherwise, and it can just be listening to this podcast, but today's the day. You need to know what it is. And if you don't know what it is, then you absolutely cannot expect the rest of your staff to know what it is.
And what sort of, if someone's listening and they're going, I'm going to go get my CEO to listen to this, and
Yeah.
I'll tell you where I'm thinking I think it's hard
Mm.
having gone through 30 years ago in a very male oriented engineering type business. You kind of try and fit in as a female in that
Mhm.
thing, even dress like them. And if you are, let's say, the lone female HR
Yeah.
person, stereotyping but quite common,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
you're standing you don't necessarily want to rock the boat or stick your neck
Mm.
out. So I'm really interested in what examples you might get them to notice, or how might you approach that conversation with the CEO or a senior stakeholder.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the thing that I would say is that every industry has its own particular vibe. And every industry has a way or an approach that kind of makes it seem like that's really normal here. Like often we hear, well, that's just the way it's been all my career, or that's how I've kind of interacted with each other. We've interacted in that way my entire career. And so it's getting to the kind of heart of what would be normal here for us that we would have to explain to interns, or you would have to explain to someone on their first
Yes.
day, of like that's so and so. He's or that's just very common the way that we interact at staff parties. We're very drink culture. What are the norms in your organization that you would have to explain to an outsider? And I don't mean like an outsider like me. I don't mean someone who's coming in and auditing and who's going to be asking questions about your culture, but like people are going to be like, is that normal here? And really getting people to think. So whether that's your CEO or whether that's everyone in your organization, of like, what are the like weirdest things about your first 3 months here? Like, what do people do that's weird, to you? And it may be that it's really, really normal and you've never thought about it, or it's been your life for 25 years. So, like, why would you think about that thing? But you've got the really obvious ones. And it's the part where we always start, and it's the part where it gets tricky right from the off, which is that harassment largely is verbal. So, it's the jokes and it's the unwanted comments about your appearance, and it's the kind of gym bro stuff, or it's comments about your sex life. And if some of those things are normal, then the question that we're asking is, why is that normal? And that's the easiest place to start. It's not an accusation. It's not, we absolutely need to get rid of this immediately. And as the sole woman in the organization, I'm not just being precious, or I'm not just being feminine about it, or I'm not just thinking, oh, that's not very couth of you to say that or talk in that way. It's I'm just being curious. I'm being curious about why we do that. Where did we get that idea from?
Yeah, that's interesting. What people consider to be banter,
Hmm.
which or believed to it's kind of almost generationally distant, that maybe 30 years ago was commonplace, and now really isn't. And I like that concept of, would you explain to an intern, or my daughter, would my 22-year-old daughter think that that is a normal conversation to have in the workplace? And it is an interesting, and so you're sort of think, let's have a conversation about this. Do we I know that's how it might have been, but is that how we want it to be or should be? Because
Mm.
you don't necessarily examine culture, you don't examine how you do things around here, do you necessarily, until you something, is that really what we want it to be?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things when you start thinking about what you would say, like often people will say, would you say that in front of your grandmother? And that can be like that can go so far. One of the things that I often say to my clients is, would you say that in front of your clients?
Mhm.
Like the backroom boiler, the kind of water cooler comments that you're making, would you say that in front of a prospective client who you were going to get a deal with? Or, you know, if the work that I do with restaurants, it's like, would you say that in front of a paying customer? You
Yeah.
probably wouldn't, unless you absolutely knew that they were going to be super on board with it. And so it's the kind of, if we were to be like in the social media age, if that were to be recorded and put online, reputational risk
Yes.
conversations of like, would we get away with that? And that's not the only reason to not do things, but sometimes you've got to think as the HR person or as the person that's kind of changing or trying to change culture, say it with transformation officers too, trying to get into the why, and everyone will have a why to get on board with this. So you'll have
Yeah.
the COOs that'll be like, okay, risk management, or you'll have the legal team that are like, it's illegal, so please can we not do that? And then you've got the financial bottom line. Like there are loads of reasons that aren't where's your basic decency or where's your human empathy, which sometimes it just feels like it's a bit light and a bit airy and a bit like, oh, well, it's not tangible and it's not connected to KPIs, so I'm not doing it. Okay, well, let's connect it to something that is real and that is tangible.
Absolutely. So those are really kind of those are ways you can explore it in a relatively non-confrontational way. Again, your point about if it was caught on social media, would we feel that represents our brand? And
Mm,
that's a really quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because that also ties into being able to recruit the best people, the people that you want to bring into the organization, want to feel that you have an inclusive culture and that they're not going to come in and be harassed.
yeah.
Are there areas in you where you see that there's real blind spots? So if you go in and work with some of these organisations, I saw you put a really interesting post on LinkedIn where you said, I'd like to say that you're much closer to your company's own version of Epstein or Al-Fayed scandal than you realise potentially. Do you want to
Mhm.
explain a little bit there, the sort of signs that people should watch out for?
Yeah, there are loads of different areas of culture that we kind of forget exist. And so you kind of got to think about it as a secret shopper, which is like when I engage with your organization, at what point might I be at risk of harmful behavior? And what we tend to see, certainly in organizations where there's a stakeholder, lots of organizations are working with another thing, even if it's online. There's a human at the end of it, somewhere. And we're thinking about the kind of experience that they might have and when they might come into contact with it. And what I see in lots of organizations is that they either do really, really well on the preventing harm for our stakeholders. So, like, if we think of theatres, for example, we do lots of work on the making sure that our theatre goers are really happy and content and know how to report harm and can, know that the ushers are trained or whatever. But then you go back of house and the stage managers are like, I have absolutely no idea where I would report that my boss is doing X. Or you've got the freelancers. When we think of your contractors, irrespective of your industry, you probably will have freelancers, clients, contractors that are working with you. And there are ways that you can navigate those relationships. We often see that people focus, and it's fair enough because time and resources are short. But we're thinking of the different aspects of your business. You're not just colleague to colleague, you're not just peer to peer, you've also got the relationships with your manager, or your relationships with senior leadership, or your relationships with the board. So in the case of the Harrods scandal, you've got kind of people who were employed talking to the board members and kind of being complicit with what the board are doing. And so we're thinking about your interactions with loads of different people. It's not just peer to peer, it's not just peer to junior or peer to senior. You've got you and the client or you and the customer. And so we've got to think about how those all play out. And if you've done work on one, don't start again from scratch. Take that approach, and just apply it and see how it applies and test it and stress test it against those kind of different groups of people. And the good news is, if you're listening to this and you're like, great, we're 5 minutes in and I'm already overwhelmed. The brilliant news is that you are not the first person, the first company to have to do this. So you can look for best practice in other organizations. Loads of people are shouting from the rooftops about how brilliant they are. Or you can do what I do, which is the cynical route, and you can go to tribunals and you can see how people have done it wrong. And you can look at people in your industry and companies in your industry that have not been brilliant. You don't have to look at every tribunal that's ever happened, but you can start from there, depending on your kind of approach and your desire to be kind of best practice or to avoid worst practice, or ideally a combination of the two, but choose one or the other, I would say.
If you were to sort of say, I don't know, the top 3 tips for prevention.
I think the best thing in terms of the best advice that I can give you is make sure that your policy reflects reality. A lot of the cookie cutter policies won't reflect your reality unless they were written for your industry. And so if you can't follow through on what it says in your policy, then don't have the policy. Just delete the whole thing. If you genuinely better for you to just not have a policy on it if you can't follow through with it. Obviously, most companies now have a bullying and harassment policy of some sort or a respect at work policy of some sort. So I think being able to look at that through the lens of a vulnerable person, being able to look at that through the lens of someone who's been reported for harm and looking at how that policy stands up. It doesn't have to be that it stands up perfectly, and it doesn't have to be that every single rule is accounted for. But I would say that you're trying to engage through the lens of the person who needs it. Loads of those policies tend to be, here's the law, and we've not really got anything else to say on the matter. But we're looking at it through the lens of a vulnerable person. And vulnerable in that sense can be either party, that's the kind of reporting person or the person who's reported, who will feel vulnerable in that process. And I often talk with clients, when you get into best practice, you've got case studies of like how this would play out. And you've got checklists for HR so that they know that they're doing everything right, and that they've covered it off, and that they know the timeframes that they're supposed to be working in and the best practice timeframes for them to be working in, so that you've not got long drawn out processes. And you've got really clear things around accountability of what accountability is likely to look like at the end of this. A lot of people go into reporting harassment assuming that the person on the other end of it is going to get a criminal conviction. Harassment isn't a criminal law. It's a civil suit. So at best, you'll go to tribunal, and being really clear from the off with your colleagues that unless there's something that crosses over into something that's criminal, like sexual assault, that this isn't going to end up with this person going to prison. And that's one of the really good kind of misunderstandings or myths, that if your policy is written well, you can bust that right off the back.
So I mean, I was thinking your point about the policies. You can imagine there's so much, like I say, cookie cutter ChatGPT policy potential out there. So it's really about making it live in a way. So would you say having example, what would be the difference between a good and a bad policy?
I think the bad policies look like they were written by ChatGPT, and I don't mean that they have M dashes in them or that they have an American spelling. It's very much, but how does that apply to me? So if you were to, like, if you work in, let's take just like a standard company where everyone works in the same place, but you've also got flexible working. And your policy doesn't mention Zoom or Teams or Slack or anything else. Very clearly was just cookie cuttered either from AI or from someone else who sold you a £10 policy. And so you've got to be able to think, okay, if I read this policy through the perspective of our people who work remotely, or the policies that I tend to see in companies where you have multiple offices, and that can be across the UK or it can be global. Even if you just have one other office, or if you're required to travel for work, and companies with one HR team, that happens. What happens if I'm in a different jurisdiction? Does my bullying and harassment policy say that we'll be following the relevant law of the country that it happens in? Or does it include remote working? Does it include the fact that in 2025 we need to appreciate that some of this is happening online, and that it will be taken as seriously, and not in a about 3 years ago, there was a very clear indication that people were copying and pasting their updates to the policy, because they were often in different fonts. And that was really easy. Now it's less easy because people know that that's what's happening. So that's not often, when I review policies, that's not often the indication. But you've got kind of different voices. So you've got first person and third person. You've got really highly legal language, and then very casual language. And there's nothing wrong with having both of those. You can have a very legal statement and then the rest of the policy be really casual. Or you have the kind of interaction with all of your other policies. If you're a policy heavy company, and particularly for small companies, it's helpful to be a policy heavy company because you're one person and you need people to be able to independently figure out what's going on. But I would say that if you are a policy heavy company, then your harassment policy has to fit in with the rest of your policies. It has to work with the rest of your policies. And so they ideally should be all written with the same sort of format. They should all have the same sort of vibe going on. And I'd say that's really important. Consistency also, in terms of the sanctions that people would receive for other things versus bullying and harassment. If there are harsher kind of punishments for uniform codes, for example, then bullying and harassment, then people are just not going to report it, full stop.
Okay, so I can hear how important it is to have that kind of foundation of organisation where you might want to try and nip it in the bud.
I think one of the main warning signs is silence. And it's really easy to kind of identify silence, although people think that it isn't. It's the like who walks in the room and everyone shuts up, or who walks into the room and everyone gets a bit shifty. And it usually isn't the CEO. I think people have the kind of Devil Wears Prada in their head when they hear that of like, yeah, CEO will walk in and everyone goes silent. But it's often can be someone senior, but it's often someone who has a lot of social power or social control, whether that is by force or that they're a really likable person. We see that kind of the good guy. He's just a good guy, like he would never have done that kind of vibes. Or he's a really good boss, so I didn't expect that to happen. But thinking about kind of body language, a lot of the kind of written cues of what's going on in a lot of places. One of the questions that I ask a lot of my clients is like, if someone in your organization were to be in the news, or if you were to receive a phone call from the police to say that one of your employees had been arrested for, in the work that I do for sexual assault, who would you not be surprised about? And I don't need you to name them, but if there's someone that comes to your head, then what are you going to do structurally about that? How do you keep people safe? How do you protect them? And how do you intervene with that person? No one is a lost cause. As humans, we're all flawed. But if you're going to work with someone because they're really good and they bring in that client, or they're really, really good at the numbers, or they're really good at strategy, but they're clearly a risk to harming the humans that you work with, what are you going to put in place for that? So thinking about what you already know, you don't need to do big audits. It's kind of a lot of it is a kind of gut reaction. It's who changes people's behaviors, but also things like who screams when they're angry, who storms out of meeting rooms, who's kind of uncontrollably ragey when you're around them, who doesn't like getting feedback and instructions, is a good indicator of people that don't take no. So when you say, don't do that or stop doing that, if we're training our colleagues to kind of call out harassment and we're saying, ask them a question or distract them or tell them to stop, and you already know that they don't like taking no for an answer, well, then that training may as well not have happened because that person is going to continue to take no for an answer.
So how do you deal with that if you're the HR person in that and you kind of know that that's Mr. Angry or Mrs. Angry, and there's a kind of undercurrent of you're never going to change them, yet they're not being performance managed for it because they've been like this for 20 years, and that is the person that you go, oh, that's just the way Fred is.
Yeah.
do you do?
I think the main thing is to find someone who has more power than Fred.
Got you.
um, in the case that you've given. So it doesn't have to be go straight to the top, but obviously if it's someone that's line managed by the CEO, then that is something that's going to happen. And if you're not the person to have that conversation with the CEO, you're going to have to find somebody else to have that conversation, because it's not enough in 2025 to be like, I was too afraid to have that conversation. We've got to connect the chains of, an intern says, or a new member of staff. I always talk about what would happen if a new member of staff joined and saw that happening.
Mm.
They'd want to walk straight out the door. They'd regret every decision that they'd ever made that ended up
Yeah.
with them here. So it's, how do you get to someone who can influence them? That doesn't always have to be directional power. It doesn't always have to be go to the person who line manages them. And in some instances, they don't want to listen to their line manager. And that might be
Yeah.
because of gender, race, sexuality. It might be because they think they're boring. It might be because they think that they're not very good leader, or whatever. Loads of people hate their managers for loads of reasons, but it could be that there's someone that that they go for a drink with after work on a Thursday, or they play the same sport as, or they watch the same football team, or they, I don't know, they do something, they have something in common and they have a friendship, and you actually know that person really well, and you know that they are really keen on creating a good environment, and they could actually have that conversation. Because you often, we're thinking about the informal, lots of your policy stuff will say, has this been informally resolved? Have you attempted to informally resolve this before we try and formally resolve it? That can be an informal resolve, to have someone say, look, buddy, I'm not sure that you know how that's coming across, but you really need to get a handle on that
Yeah.
particular behavior. You don't have to go nuclear with it in the first instance, even if it's been going on for years. You
But it
don't
is,
have to
but
go
you
nuclear
said
with
that whole thing about it can't be about silence. And I think that's the whole crux of this is
it.
you need enough people with personal power, with influence in
Yeah,
your organization at different levels who
yeah,
are prepared to confront in a
mm,
constructive way.
yeah,
And so many organizations don't give feedback, or are not comfortable with talking. And again, it's often because of the reaction. So all at the root of all this is people being open and honest and providing feedback and communicating positively, isn't it?
yeah. And the inverse of that is thinking about how we reward silence and complicity in the
Yeah.
organization. And that's a really hard question to kind of confront. But we're not thinking about kind of giving bonuses to the people who get the most reports, but we are thinking about how we can kind of get rid of this culture of silence. And a lot of that is the systems. So we're putting a lot of pressure on individuals, but we're thinking about the systems. So we're thinking about what happens when you report it. We're thinking about what happens if you are the person that has an informal conversation with somebody else. Is that labor acknowledged
Mm.
by HR, by the CEO, that you're the person that's having these conversations, that you've got situational power, and that you're doing really amazing work for our culture, rather than the only rewards in the business being for KPIs that are to do with money, or that are revenue goal kind of oriented things. This is and will affect your bottom line. So how do you tip the scales so that when people report stuff, they feel that you will handle it fairly, that you'll be transparent about the results, and even if the outcome is we couldn't uphold it, that you're not pretending that that was never going to happen, or that you've not just left it and been like, so he's free on all charges, or so they're free on everything, and we
Yeah.
we think that they're absolutely grand and our best case culture champion. Rather than, what tends to happen is they get moved. So they get moved to another job, they get moved
Yeah.
out of working with that group of people, and they get a cushy wee number alongside it. So they get maybe moved aside to another senior leadership position, rather than said, actually, because of your behavior, we're taking you off the senior leadership team until you can prove we've performance managed the part of you that is in charge of people. We can't have you in charge of people. We can't have you managing humans until you can manage humans in a way that is basic decency. You're not asking them to be culture champions. And
No.
again, in lots of the work that I have done, and lots of the research that we see in across loads of organizations, they'll say the biggest kick in the teeth for me wasn't reporting it and the person not being found to have done it, because it was a he said, she said. The problem was they then got promoted before me, or they then got put in charge of culture or equity, and obviously that was a kick in the teeth.
Yeah.
So we're thinking about what happens when, and thinking about that cycle of what you do with that information when someone is investigated, which isn't that you punish them based on no information at all, but largely this stuff isn't happening in a vacuum. There are very, very few people who were like, I did one oopsie. Like, no, you did more than one oopsie, and everyone knows that you're more
Yeah.
than one oopsie in.
So it's just happened that oopsie was reported in terms of it. But there's an awful lot of, I don't know, history of people just getting their heads down and, you know, keeping their head under the parapet and not getting involved. But you've really got to be, and then people learn in terms of these things. It's quite an interesting topic there, I guess. Enya, any final tips? If you talked about having your policies up to date, you know, kind of getting people with the influencers in your organisation that can help. Any other final tips for our audience if they want to really address this? Actually, one thing I haven't covered about, I was thinking about what to put about training. If you wanted to sort of get it discussed, what would you say that's important, sort of build awareness in some way?
Yes, I would say that training is usually people's go-to, and it has become, particularly in EDI, it has become a kind of tick box exercise. And so I would say when it comes to training, please don't make your entire harassment prevention strategy e-learning. Please don't. If you do absolutely nothing else that I've said, please do not make that your entire strategy, because it won't work.
No.
Training is an important part, awareness is an important part, and I would say more than anything, if you're looking at your budget and you're thinking, I can't train all of my staff, train your managers, not just your senior leaders, train your managers, anyone who has responsibility, whether it's for a team of 1 or a team of 25, train your managers to recognize, respond well, and to know how to report and to pass on things in a good way. So not doing it without the consent of the person that has told them that they've been harmed, making sure that
Yeah.
they know beyond mental health first aiders how to signpost people to external places that they can get support and get help. Make sure that your managers are trained. Again, preferably not by e-learning. This isn't me cancelling e-learning, but it can, if you're tight on budget, e-learning cannot be your solution, please.
It strikes me actually that this sort of thing, I think where we've talked about, you know, women's, you know, gender equality and things like that, that it doesn't have to cost any money. You could almost have a lunch discussion and say, let's just go, what does harassment look like? What would you consider to be insulting? What would you, and just having those conversations and real life examples. And so, I might say, I don't know, stupid example. If I say, oh, guys is a term, if I'm training people, I might say, hi guys, or so. It's just like, I mean, that's a generic term. Not everybody likes that. And lots of us have terms that we're not, and you know, you're not trying to offend, but having that awareness, just those conversations, they can be free. And I think that could be more powerful than e-learning in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like community and being in community with your colleagues, they're not just people who you transactionally pass note to note on. These are people who have lives outside of the work that you do with them. And if you harass someone at work, they don't just clock out of work at whatever time and go home and they're grand. So thinking about the kind of human to human interactions of like, things that might have happened to you in other workplaces, and we're thinking about it in a trauma-informed place and not trauma dumping and all of the other things that you as a psychologist are much more capable of talking about, Lucinda, but definitely being able to kind of have conversations where people can say, like, I want to talk about this, or here's a case study, like, let's talk about a case study. What would you do in this hypothetical scenario? What do you think the best possible response is in this scenario? And being able to have those conversations, not a this is likely to happen to you or this happened here, but taking the tribunal examples of like, what would you do if this happened in your office or in your team? And being able to gather where people are at now
Also,
and what you need them to know.
could be really interesting conversation, and particularly with so many different generations in the workplace, as long as it's all done with respect, that could be a really good sort of educational way of people realizing something they don't mean to be offensive.
Yeah, and it works in loads of different ways, and there are lots of kind of, the work that I do, even if you think of the kind of differences, the North-South divide in England, for example, even around language. If we think of complimenting someone on their appearance, or calling someone pet or dear or darling. Lived in the northeast of England for almost 10 years. That was very commonplace there. And because it was so commonplace, I never questioned it. Whereas now in London, if someone were to talk to me like that way, I'd be like, stop being so patronising. Whereas I never would have considered that it was patronising in the Northeast, or never would have thought of it that way. And you've got people coming from all over the world who have cultural norms, who have expectations, who use particular language, who are coming into wherever you're based and being like, oh, it's like learning a new language. And for some of them, it is actually an actual new language and it is an actual new culture. But there are also loads of people from different parts of the UK who are like, is this normal here? Is like, am I supposed to be good with this? Can I just check if this is okay, and why we're okay with this? And I think curiosity is key. Like the one piece of advice that I always give, whether it's in training, whether it's working with senior leaders, is ask one more question. Just be curious. Like if something is weird, just ask someone why they said it. Just like, where's that come from? Like, I've never heard that before. Or why did you say that? Because it can unlock something that's systemic or structural rather than just assuming that it's a bad apple or a bad actor.
And also it can kind of by examining it, building awareness of it, people might go, do you know, I don't know where that is, and actually it doesn't fit. You stop it perpetuating, just by that awareness.
Yeah, or like, I don't know why I'm so attached to complimenting you on your outfit every Monday. Like, I don't know why I'm so attached to that. Rather than it being like, stop, we're not going to have a conversation about it. Like having a conversation with people about things that make you feel a bit off. And then if they respond poorly, then you can take that further. But most people, and in the kind of divisive land that we live in, and the way that we talk about disagreeing at the moment, it can often feel like that's going to lead to a massive war. Most people will be like, I've never thought about it. Like I've never thought about the impact of saying something like that, or I've never thought about what my intention is behind that. So it's a good question. I don't know the answer, but it's a good question.
Yeah. I mean, that is an interesting one. We could go down that rabbit hole, because I was thinking that actually saying, oh, that's a great colour on you, or something like that, can be a really great rapport builder in a positive way. So you don't have to just ignore people completely. So Sonia, if people want your consistency, you're easy to find on the internet and on LinkedIn. So also post your links in there. So just tell us a little bit about the work you do. So if people reach out to you, they know why.
Yeah, for sure. So I do a lot of work with CEOs, senior leadership teams, HR directors of all sizes of companies doing all sorts of things. But we're looking at kind of prevention and management of harassment, but also just generally how it fits into your culture. So if you're looking at your recruitment strategies or you're looking at your retention approaches, then I would definitely recommend bringing this in. I've got a free resource, which is 24 questions you should be asking about preventing harassment, which Lucinda will post in the show notes, and you can access that. You can obviously also contact me anywhere. I've also got a weekly email called Decency Mail, which is designed to kind of get to the heart of things. So we're getting the kind of recent scandals, research that's been done, kind of policies and procedures that you ought to have and the way you have them, but ultimately proactive things. No one has time. And so we're thinking about the steps that you can take today and tomorrow to make sure that you have a respectful workplace that works for your actual workplace, is not just cookie cutter nonsense.
Yeah, prevention being less than cure and personalising it. Obviously, thank you so much for joining me this week on the HR Uprising podcast, Enya.
It's a pleasure.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.